I heard the printer before I saw the drawer move. That scratching sound had a way of getting under the skin in that building. It was never loud, just a dry, patient rasp, like something with paper lungs trying to breathe. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed unevenly, one pitch high, one low, and the air carried that familiar mix of antiseptic and old dust, the smell of files that had outlived the people inside them. I was standing alone in intake when the middle drawer slid open on its own. Not all the way. Just enough to catch, then continue with a shudder, metal on metal, until the body bag inside was visible under the strip light. There was a tag looped through the zipper pull. My name was on it. Warren Kessler. The date underneath was that day's date. For a second, I fixated on the handwriting, because that was how my mind worked then. The block letters were clean, county standard, the same style we used on all intake tags. No smudging, no hesitation in the pen strokes. Whoever had written it had known exactly how much space my name would take. The paperwork clipped to the bag listed sex, height, identifying marks, all of it close enough to make my mouth go dry. Cause of death was typed in the usual line. Clerical discrepancy. Behind me, the printer started up again. I turned, and page after page fed out into the tray, each one bearing my signature at the bottom, the same tight slant I'd used for years, the same break in the capital K where my pen always dragged. I hadn't touched a pen. The drawer was still open behind me. I could feel cold air breathing out of it onto the backs of my legs, and all I could think was, and if the office had already decided I was the mistake, what exactly had it come there to correct? It had started 3 days earlier with a routine intake. Most people imagined a county coroner's office as one room and a stainless steel table, maybe a fridge, maybe a tired man in gloves. That was true in some places. It wasn't true in Stillwater County. Our office sat outside Columbus, low and square against the wind, attached to the county records annex by a narrow enclosed hall that always smelled faintly of wet cardboard in spring and hot insulation in winter. Up front it was administrative. Phones, printers, permit files, death certificates, the usual machinery of making loss official. In the rear it was practical. Prep room, cold storage, intake bay. Under all of that, below the concrete and the drains and the humming compressors, there was the old archive. That was where the county kept what it no longer trusted to computers. I'd grown up in Stillwater County. I knew the names on the mailboxes out by Absaroki, the family cemeteries behind cottonwood windbreaks, which roads drifted shut first when the weather turned. I'd worked enough years in that office to know the sound each door made when it settled. There was pride in that, or maybe just habit. In a place where people still expected you to look them in the eye at the grocery store after you certified a relative's death, precision mattered. Paper mattered. Once a report was signed and entered, it didn't just describe what had happened. Around here, it became what had happened. I didn't say that out loud to people because it sounded grandiose, maybe even superstitious, but I believed it in the same quiet way I believed in frost depth and chain of custody. Facts were only facts if they held under pressure. My job was to make them hold. That morning the lights were acting up again, one bank flickering just enough to register at the edge of vision. Lila Granger was already in, bent over the supply cabinet with her hair tied back and a clipboard braced against her forearm. She'd become deputy coroner the year before after doing records work for the county. Younger than me by about a decade. Lean, deliberate, not much wasted movement. There was always a look about her like she'd heard the end of a conversation before you'd started it. "Morning," she said without turning. "Anything overnight?" "One ranch pickup, natural causes pending, and a transport from Nye." She shut the cabinet with her hip. "You intake packets on your desk." Her voice was calm in a way I'd once found reassuring. Later I'd think about how little surprise there ever was in it. I took the folder into my office. The room still had the same scar on the edge of the desk from where someone had dropped a metal file tray years before. Same warped baseboard by the radiator. Same cabinet drawer that's stuck in damp weather. I noticed those things every morning. I always had. I liked the solidity of them, objects that stayed where they were put. The intake itself was ordinary enough. Male, middle-aged. Found in a truck off a county road after a storm. Body recovered before dawn. No immediate signs of foul play. There were minor inconsistencies in the transport sheet, the kind you saw all the time. A height estimate that didn't match the driver's license by an inch. In a spelled-out middle name in one place and an initial in another. Time of recovery copied once as before sunrise and once as just after. That last one made me pause, not because it was unusual, but because of the handwriting. The correction in the margin looked familiar. Not mine. Just familiar. I smelled dust before I realized I'd opened one of the old side cabinets. That papery, dry smell rose off the folders stored there, mixed with the clean sting of antiseptic from the prep room beyond the wall. It steadied me. I signed off on the intake review, made a note to verify the timeline with the responding deputy, and carried the packet back out. Lila was at the printer, thumbing through supply invoices. "Transport sheet sloppy," I said. "Tell dispatch I want the original call log." She nodded. You want me to pull the archive template too?" "For what?" She looked at me for half a beat too long. "Nothing. You just usually compare." I told her I didn't. She said all right. We both knew I often did. That was the first little fracture, not the supernatural kind. The human kind. That unpleasant moment when someone else seems to know one of your habits better than you do. I let it go. The rest of the morning stayed routine. Phone call from a funeral home. A family asking about release paperwork. Otis Halbrecht from the clerk's side shuffling through the hall with a banker's box hugged to his chest, smelling like wool and stale coffee in the county's central storage room. Otis had been there longer than either of us. He moved carefully as if even his joints had been trained by filing procedures. He paused at my door and said, "Do you still signing hard copies first?" "I sign both." "Good," he said. "One of these days the machines will decide they don't need us." It was meant as a joke, I think. I smiled without much warmth and went back to my desk. Looking back, that was the last morning I still believed the office only kept records. By early afternoon I was reviewing the intake again because one line kept bothering me. It wasn't the deceased. It was the phrasing in the provisional cause field. Exposure had been typed, then struck through in the digital entry before finalization. Cardiac event had replaced it. That should have been impossible without a user log, and the system should have preserved both versions in the edit history. It didn't. I clicked back. The history field was blank, and the fluorescent hum overhead took on that insect dryness it got when the ballast started failing. And from somewhere behind the wall I heard a printer scratch once, then stop. I was alone in the office. Lila had gone to receive a transport. Otis was across the hall in clerk records. I leaned closer to the monitor and watched the cursor blink in the cause of death line. Cardiac event. Blink. Cardiac event secondary to cold stress. Blink. Accidental exposure. The words replaced themselves one segment at a time. No typing sound, no visible input, just letters resolving as if a hand I couldn't see had already decided where they belonged. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. I checked the terminal connection, then the network log, then the permissions. When that showed nothing useful, I called down the hall for Lila. No answer. And the air felt cooler all at once, and I became aware of the old file smell again, thickened somehow as if someone had opened archive boxes nearby. Then the printer in the corner started. I knew it wasn't connected because I'd unplugged it 2 days earlier after it jammed on label stock. I had set the cable on top of the cabinet myself. I looked at it now, draped loose and gray in the dim light, while the machine fed out a single page, then another. I went over and pulled the top sheet free while the second was still printing. It was the same report I'd been reviewing, same county header, same case number. But the cause of death line had changed, not just to accidental exposure. The wording was arranged exactly the way I used to phrase findings when I wanted a death to settle cleanly inside county expectations. Minimal friction. No unnecessary traction for insurance, civil liability, or families looking for someone to blame. I knew the pattern because I'd built it. What stopped me cold was the handwriting in the margin, my handwriting. A note along the side read, "Findings consistent with environmental conditions, no evidence of intervening trauma materially contributing." The sentence was mine down to the rhythm of it. That was how I softened things. That was how I made rough edges file smooth. I hadn't written it. I stood there with the paper in my hand and felt the fine grit of toner under my thumb. The room smelled hot now, like warmed plastic and dust. The printer kept running until 3 copies sat in the tray, all identical, all bearing the same margin note. I took the report back to the computer and pulled up the earlier version to compare. There wasn't one. The screen showed only the corrected wording, fully entered, fully time-stamped, no sign anything had ever differed. That was when the back of my neck went cold. Because it wasn't just impossible, it was familiar. 3 years earlier, in that same office, I had made a report cleaner than the body behind it deserved. I hadn't thought of that case in months, maybe longer. Not directly. But the cadence of that margin note had come from the same part of me. The part that knew how to flatten a jagged truth into language the county could live with. I told myself it was coincidence. Muscle memory from old reports. Some bizarre autofill error pulling from archived phrasing. Then I looked again at the signature line. It was blank on the screen. On the printed pages, my signature was already there, not a copy. Not a scanned signature block. Fresh pen pressure in blue ink, the downstroke on the W heavier than the rest, exactly as it got when my hand was tired. I heard the intake bell ring out in the bay. I flinched hard enough to hate myself for it. When I stepped into the hall, Lila was coming in through the rear door, stripping off gloves. There was wind in her hair and cold air following her. "You print that?" I asked, holding up the report. She looked at it. Not surprised, not confused, just attentive. "No," she said. "Did it update?" That word lodged in me. "Update," I repeated. She set the gloves in the bin. "Sometimes they do that." "What do you mean, sometimes they do that?" "The files, they correct." I laughed once. It came out dry. "That isn't a sentence." She met my eyes, and for the first time that day I had the unpleasant sense that she was measuring what I could tolerate hearing. "It is here," she said. I should have pushed harder right then. I know that now. Instead, I asked her who else had access to the terminal. She gave me a list of names I already knew. That evening, before I locked up, I checked the server backup and the local cache. The original version was gone from both. That was the moment the past stopped staying buried where I'd put it. The next morning, I came in early before sunrise because I wanted time alone with the system. Not the public side, not the intake paperwork, just the machine itself. The building always sounded different then. No voices, no carts rolling. Just the refrigeration units cycling in the back. The soft tick in the hallway heater, and in that dry fluorescent buzz overhead like the office was thinking with its teeth clenched. The air carried 2 smells more strongly in the morning than at any other time. Antiseptic from the prep room and the stale paper weight of the archive. If you worked there long enough, the mix stopped reading as strange. It just smelled like certainty. Leela was already there. She was at the central file table with 3 folders open in front of her and a mug going cold by her elbow. Steam no longer rose from it, but I could smell bitter coffee under the dust and toner. "You sleep here?" I asked. "Not this time," she said. That answer irritated me more than if she'd joked. I set down my bag and pulled the corrected report from my case folder. "You said yesterday the file's correct. Explain that sentence." She glanced at the page, then at me. Not every discrepancy matters." That wasn't an explanation. "No," she said. "It was a warning." She said it quietly, without posture, and somehow that made it worse. I asked her how long she'd known about this. She thought about it, not because she needed to remember, because she was deciding how far to go. "I used to think it was just stories," she said. "Old county stuff. Things clerks tell each other because every office with a basement eventually grows folklore. Missing carbon copies, death certificates that got reissued with slightly different names, people swearing they'd filed one thing and finding another. I thought it was bad indexing and worse memory. You don't anymore." She shook her head. "What changed?" Her fingers rested on the top folder, tapping once against the paper. I watched a file number repeat. I frowned. "You'd repeat where?" She turned one folder around and pushed it toward me. Then another, then a third. Different years, different decedents. A barn fall, an unattended death in a trailer outside Fishtail, a vehicle rollover on an icy bridge. Separate cases, separate dates, different names, same file number. Exactly the same. Digit for digit, county prefix and suffix included. "That's impossible," I said. "I know." "Did you report it?" "To who?" I had no answer ready for that. There wasn't a form for a county database deciding history was optional. Lila took a sip of coffee and made a face because it had gone cold. Once I noticed the number, I started seeing other things. Reissued findings with no audit trail. Intake tags printed before the body arrived. Small stuff at first. The kind you can explain if you want to. And then not so small. And you're just fine with it. That got the first real reaction out of her. Not anger, something more tired. "I'm not fine with it," she said. "I'm practical about it." I almost told her that was the same thing in county government. I didn't. Instead, I spread the duplicate files across the table and compared the metadata, searching for an administrative explanation, a software migration error, a botched consolidation from paper to digital years back. Every path dead-ended. The numbers were identical because the system insisted they were identical, and every other field bent around that insistence. The buzzing in the ceiling grew louder. Or maybe I was just paying closer attention. "What happens when they correct?" I asked. Lila stared into her mug. "Usually the thing that changed is small, a date, a middle initial, even whether a report gets printed twice. If you leave it alone, it settles." "And if you don't?" She looked up at me then. There was pity in it, and I hated her a little for that. "You make it notice you." I remember the chill that ran along my forearms when she said that. Not because of the words themselves, because some part of me had already been living as if I'd been noticed a long time ago. I asked her if anyone else knew. She said Otis did, though he preferred not to discuss it until necessary. I asked how necessary was defined. She said, "Usually by whether your name shows up." That landed heavier than it should have, given that I hadn't yet told her what I'd seen in intake. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd already seen it herself. I told her I wanted all archived documentation on anomalous corrections. She stood up immediately, as if she'd expected that request from the moment I walked in. "Basement," she said. "Back row, left side, old clerk overflow. There's an unsigned folder." "Unsigned by who?" "No one ever leaves a name on that one." Before I went down, I stopped at my office to check the report again. The cause of death line had changed one more time. Same meaning, different phrasing, more concise, cleaner, better if your goal was for nobody to ask questions. My stomach tightened. That was the last normal conversation I had with Lila, though I didn't know it while we were standing there. The stairs to the archive were concrete and always colder than the rest of the building. The handrail had a tacky feel from old paint and disinfectant. Halfway down, the smell changed. Less antiseptic, more paper, glue, mildew sealed and then dried out again over decades. The basement held onto history physically. It was in the air, not just the shelves. The archive itself ran beneath the prep rooms and part of the records annex. Low ceiling, metal shelving, narrow aisles, old rolling ladders no one trusted. Each row had handwritten placards wired to the end caps. Retired cases, probate overflow, old coroner inquests, county clerk duplicates, all of it sleeping under fluorescent tubes that buzzed like trapped flies. Lila had been right. The unsigned folder was exactly where she said it would be, tucked behind a line of flood-damaged tax ledgers. Thin manila, no label. The paper inside was newer than the folder, crisp and white against that basement smell. The first page was just a list. No title, no author. The typing was clean, county standard, and if a file corrects itself, do not read the previous version aloud. I stood there a long time with the page in my hand, listening to the building hum overhead through the pipes and concrete. The instruction was absurd on its face, which meant it should have been easy to dismiss. It wasn't. Because the phrasing wasn't absurdity, it was procedure. Someone had written it in the voice of a person who expected to be obeyed by frightened professionals. The second line read, "If your name appears on intake documentation, do not acknowledge it." My mouth went dry. The third, "Do not remove or destroy any record once it has been updated." The fourth, "If a body matches an active employee, process it immediately." And the fifth, "Do not contradict the printed cause of death under any circumstances." I read them twice without speaking, and that mattered to me in a way I didn't yet understand. Even then, some instinct was already negotiating with the page. Behind those instructions were copies of older cases. At first they looked like standard retention material. Then the details started to shear off from common sense. A deputy clerk listed as deceased in the late 1990s, cause of death administrative conflict, yet payroll records in the next folder showed she worked for the county another 9 years after that. A record supervisor whose name had been typed over with correction fluid and replaced by one of the morgue attendants. An old photograph paper clipped to a file where 3 staff members stood beside a transport van. Only one face scratched out so hard the paper had torn. I kept going. Dust coated my fingertips. Somewhere water ticked in a pipe. Above me, I faint through the floor. I heard a gurney wheel roll and stop. Then I found the report. Mine. Not literally mine. Not the copy from my office. The original case file from 3 years before, complete with scene photos, transport forms, weather records, witness statements, my findings, and the final certified cause of death. The migrant worker had been found behind a calving shed on a ranch west of town after the first hard freeze. At the time, I'd documented exposure, environmental conditions, extended time outdoors. I'd kept the language broad and the mechanism clean. What I had left out were the injuries that made exposure a convenience rather than a cause. Fractures across the left ribs, bruising along the jaw and shoulder consistent with impact against equipment. Blood on a gate hinge that had never made it into the final narrative. In statements from 2 other workers about a broken hydraulic chute and a ranch owner who delayed calling anyone because he didn't want inspectors on the property. I had seen all of it. I had signed something else. The corrected file in my hands restored every omitted line. The trauma section was back. The witness statements were intact. My softened conclusion had been struck through and replaced with wording so direct it made my chest feel hollow. Death caused by untreated blunt force injuries complicated by prolonged exposure following employer negligence. My name remained at the bottom. So did my signature. For a second, I couldn't hear the lights, couldn't hear the pipes, couldn't feel the chill in the basement. There was only the dry drag of my thumb across the page and the old, sour taste that climbed into my throat when I recognized the exact sentence where I had betrayed a dead man for a living one. I'd told myself good reasons at the time. The worker had no family in county. The ranch kept half the town employed in one way or another. The sheriff wanted quiet. The county attorney wanted avoidable litigation off his desk before election season. And me? I wanted the paperwork closed before it turned into a fight I'd lose anyway. So I changed the report. That was the truth I had spent 3 years filing under professional necessity. In the basement, with the corrected report in my hands, it finally sounded like what it was. Cowardice. I set the folder down, and it slid half an inch across the shelf as if the paper underneath had breathed. Another file beside it shifted. I looked over and saw a decedent's name. I typed cleanly at the top of the page, begin to blur. Not visually, physically. Ink sinking, then rising again, letters collapsing into a wet line. When it settled, my own name was there. Warren Kessler. The ink looked fresh enough to touch. I backed up hard enough to hit the shelf behind me. A stack of county binders rustled. Dust shook loose into the cold air. I stared at the file until the letters wavered and slowly returned to the original name. My hands were shaking then, not wildly, just enough to make the paper sound loud. I knew now what the office had found in me. I just didn't know what it meant to be corrected by something that treated a man and a line item as the same category of error. The intake bell rang upstairs, once, then twice. The body came in just before dusk. By then, I'd brought the unsigned rules upstairs. He copied the corrected file and locked the basement report in my office cabinet, even though I suspected locks were already a courtesy the building no longer extended me. My head hurt from the lights. My tongue tasted metallic the way it did after too much bad coffee and not enough water. I'd spent most of the afternoon trying to prove the basement material had been fabricated, misfiled, or planted. I failed at all three. Lila said very little. She moved through the office with the focused calm of someone waiting for a storm she'd already packed for. At one point, I asked her if she had ever seen a corrected employee file. She said yes. I asked what happened to the employee. She took too long to answer. Depends how much they resist, she said. When the rear bell sounded again, she was the one who went to receive the transport. I followed. A cold air knifed in through the loading door, carrying diesel exhaust and the mineral smell of evening snow somewhere far off. The transport driver handed over the paperwork without making eye contact, which was normal. People who worked with the dead often developed little rituals of avoidance. I never judged that. The gurney wheel clicked over the threshold. The body bag on it was zipped to the collarbone and covered with a county sheet. There's an issue with identification, the driver said. What kind of issue? He shrugged like he didn't want ownership of the answer. Tag doesn't match what dispatch told me. Figure you'll sort it. He left quickly. I pulled back the sheet. The tag attached to the zipper read my name. Not exactly my information. The birth date was off by 1 day. The height estimate added an inch. But the rest of it tightened my lungs. Same sex, same general build, same hair color. Even the identifying mark section listed an old scar on my forearm from a barbed wire fence when I was 12. Absolutely not, I said. Lila didn't touch the bag. We should process it. It's mislabeled. Her eyes went to the tag and then back to me. Is it? I unzipped the bag down to the sternum. The skin inside had that cold wax look refrigerated bodies get. The face was partly obscured by lividity and a bruise across the brow, but the structure underneath was too close. Same nose, same shape at the jaw. Not identical. Not enough for a stranger to mistake us in daylight. Enough that my stomach dropped anyway. Get dispatch back on the line, I said. Now. Lila didn't move. Lila, if it matches an active employee, she said quietly, it has to be processed immediately. I stared at her. You knew. I knew it might come to intake. You knew and you said nothing. Her expression changed then, not to guilt, but to something like frustration that I was still insisting on surprise. I tried to tell you the practical version. This is insanity. No, she said. It's consistency. I almost hit the table. Instead, I gripped the edge so hard the stainless steel chilled straight through my palms. The room smelled sharply of disinfectant and cold metal and the faint, sweet note that comes from bodies before they warm enough to truly announce themselves. The lights buzzed. The compressor kicked on behind us. Process what? I said. In a stranger with a wrong tag? A match. A typo. Warren. The way she said my name made it sound like a line she'd already rehearsed for herself. If you refuse intake, the discrepancy moves deeper. That's worse. For who? She didn't answer. That was answer enough. I re-zipped the bag, not gently. No. She stepped back as if I'd confirmed something to her, and in that movement I realized the rule in the basement hadn't felt like a warning because it was mystical. It had felt like a warning because people in this building had learned through repetition what happened when you ignored procedure. I just hadn't known I was already inside the procedure. I refused to sign the intake. I told myself I was rejecting bad data, nothing more. The tag didn't fully match, the birth date was wrong, the face wasn't mine. By the time I used those details to justify the refusal, I understood with a part of myself I was still denying that the office would not care about the differences. Only the similarity. Lila covered the body again. You should talk to Otis. About what? About balance. I laughed at that, and it sounded uglier than I meant it to. Since when does the county clerk lecture on metaphysics? Since you became one of his files. She wheeled the gurney into cold storage herself. I stayed in intake, listening to the drawer seals engage with a heavy rubber sigh. The printer in the adjacent office started up again, even though no one was at a terminal. Looking back, that was the moment I stopped being a coroner and became a pending correction. Otis Halbrecht kept his office warmer than the rest of the building, in which only made the smell of paper stronger. Not fresh paper. Old paper. Carbon copies, envelope glue, file jackets handled by too many dry hands. He had a space heater under the desk and a lamp with a yellow shade that made everything look already archived. When I walked in without knocking, he looked up over his glasses as if he'd been expecting a scheduled appointment. You finally came, he said. The words turned my stomach. He motioned to the chair across from him. I stayed standing. My pulse was still too high from intake, and there was a stiffness in my fingers I couldn't shake, like cold had gotten into the joints. A body came in with my name on it. I know. How? He tilted his head toward the wall we shared with records. Printer told me. I didn't sit. He sighed, folded his hands on the desk. Enan adopted the patient expression of a man about to explain office policy to someone he considered intelligent but unprepared. The county record system, he said, doesn't tolerate discrepancies well. It's a database. It was a ledger before it was a database. It was indexed on cards before it was a ledger. Before that, it was books. Doesn't matter what form it takes. Same principle. What principle? That once something is entered officially, reality has to stop arguing with it. There are sentences that sound ridiculous until they touch the part of your life that already proved them. I stood there hearing him say that and thought about the report from 3 years earlier. About how quickly the sheriff had stopped asking questions once I certified exposure. How the ranch owner had carried on. How the dead workers' injuries had ceased to matter the instant they lost administrative standing. Otis watched me understand just enough and mistook it for agreement. "It isn't punishment," he said. "That's the important thing." What would you call it? Reconciliation. The word had a clerk's comfort to it. Balanced books, clean margins, two sides forced to meet. I asked him how many times he'd seen this happen. He said enough to stop counting. I asked him whether the people listed as dead in those old files had actually died. He rubbed at a spot on his desk where the varnish had worn thin. "Some of them did later," he said. "Some of them didn't exactly. Not in the way you mean." That should have been the line that sent me out the door for good. Instead, I asked the wrong question. What happens if the original record is false? Otis looked at me with sudden, exact attention. There was no surprise in his face, no curiosity. He had known from the start which file had pulled me under. "The system can't preserve contradiction indefinitely," he said. "If a report is false, something has to adjust. Sometimes it's the record. Sometimes it's whatever keeps the record from being true." I felt the room shift then, not physically, but in function. His office stopped being a place where explanations were offered and became a place where my category was being assigned. I said, "You mean people." He didn't correct me. From down the hall, faint through the door, I heard a voice dictating findings: male, county adult, no visible trauma inconsistent with certified cause. My voice. I froze, and Otis kept talking for a second before he noticed I wasn't listening. The voice continued in the hall, calm and professional, the exact cadence I used when recording preliminary notes at the end of a long shift. I knew the pauses in it, knew where I tended to breathe. The problem was I hadn't spoken. I crossed to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty, fluorescent lights buzzing, dust smell, nothing else. But the dictation kept going, now from farther away, as though it had moved ahead of me around the corner. Otis stood behind me in the doorway. "Don't chase your own paperwork," he said. I turned on him so fast my shoulder hit the jam. "What did you just say?" "Your voice appears before your hand does sometimes. Once it starts, the entries aren't far behind. Why aren't you afraid of this?" He considered that. And for a moment I saw the cost of his composure, not courage, erosion. "Because fear suggests choice," he said. "This is county procedure. It doesn't care how I feel about it." Then, in a softer tone that unsettled me more than anything else he'd said, he added, "You made a discrepancy permanent, Warren. The office notices that sort of ambition." He knew. Not just that there had been a false report. He knew the shape of it, the intention, the hand behind the edit. "How much do you know about that case?" I asked. He smiled without humor. "Enough to recognize your style. You borrowed the edema wording from an old winter exposure template and forgot to change one verb tense. It always bothered the file." I was still staring at him when the printer in his office woke up. It hadn't been on, and I knew because the status light was dark when I came in. Now paper fed out in short, clean bursts. Otis didn't even turn. I did. The page in the tray was a memo on county letterhead. Brief. No signature. Employee status under review due to unresolved clerical discrepancy. Subject has demonstrated non-compliance with active reconciliation. And beneath that, smaller text, as if added later. Do not allow subject access to destructive means. I picked it up. The paper was warm. Otis reached past me and took it back with an almost apologetic motion. "That one's for me," he said. That was when I understood there would be no ally in that office who wasn't already partly administered by it. I went straight to my office and locked the door. The lock clicked too softly to reassure. On my desk were 3 files I had not pulled. In each bore my handwriting and margin notes correcting cause fields on unrelated cases. A rancher's widow, an overdose in a motel, a fall from a grain bin ladder, my pen pressure, my abbreviations, my habit of drawing a small line through zeros so they wouldn't be mistaken for O's. I sat down slowly because sudden motion felt like admitting panic and spread them out. I had no memory of touching any of them. The contamination of it was worse than the fear, much worse. Fear stays outside you until it doesn't. This felt like finding someone had been borrowing my hands. That was the hour when my memories first started to loosen from the paper. By the next day, the building had stopped behaving like a workplace and started behaving like a process. I wish I meant that metaphorically, I don't. The loops began small. A conversation with Lila at the supply cabinet where she asked if I wanted the archived template. I heard it once before breakfast. Then again, near noon, same words, same flat turn in her voice, but this time I was holding a different file and the mug in her hand was blue instead of white. Otis passed my office twice carrying the same banker's box with the same split seam along the side. The intake bell rang once for a delivery that never arrived, then later for a delivery I had already logged. Every repetition came with one detail shifted, as though the office wasn't replaying events but revising them. I checked the system clock against my watch. At first they matched. Later they didn't. A report I had opened at mid-afternoon refreshed in front of me and showed a timestamp from 20 minutes earlier than when I'd first viewed it. But I thought I'd misread it. Then it updated again, moving backward another 7 minutes. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. Time in that building had become just another field subject to correction. The printer sounds never stopped now. Even when every machine in the office sat dark, I could hear the faint scratching from inside walls, beneath desks, beyond closed doors. The noise of a record being made somewhere just out of sight. The lights buzzed, the vents sighed. Paper smell thickened whenever I opened a folder I didn't remember taking from the shelf, and the handwriting spread. Sticky notes appeared on my desk in my script, reminding me to review files I'd never seen. Marginal corrections surfaced in archived cases dated years before I took office, but written in the hand I had now. Once in the prep room, I found my own block letters on the whiteboard under daily tasks. Verified discrepancy against physical remains. I wiped it off with a gloved hand. A faint shadow of the words stayed behind, as if the marker had soaked into the enamel. My memories grew holes around the same places the files changed. The worker on the ranch, the meeting with the sheriff. Whether Lila had been in records then or already shadowing intake, I could still remember the weight of the pen when I signed the altered report. But some of the reasons I'd told myself had begun to sound planted, generic, like excuses copied from a training memo. I didn't know if the system was stripping lies away or feeding me cleaner ones. That uncertainty was its own terror. Near evening, I went down to the basement again because I needed something solid, physical records, pages that couldn't vanish with a refresh. The air down there was colder than before, enough to sting the inside of my nose. Dust lifted under my shoes. In the far aisle, a pull chain swayed slightly as if someone had just brushed past it. I found the corrected ranch file where I'd left it. Beside it was a new folder with no tab label. Inside were incident summaries for cases I had never worked, all bearing my signature. Every correction aligned a difficult death with a simpler story. Every simplified story benefited someone local, a landowner, an insurer, a county department, It read like a portfolio of moral laziness curated by a clerk with a grudge. I wanted to tell myself the office was framing me through pattern recognition, that it had taken the one lie it knew and extrapolated. But when I touched the pages, I recognized some of the phrasing because those were the shortcuts I took in my head even when I didn't take them on paper. The language of minimizing, the habit of asking which truth the county could survive. That was what finally stripped away my last useful denial. The office wasn't inventing an alternate me. It had found the administrative version that had always existed and given it full authority. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Lila stood at the end of the aisle under the weak light, hands in the pockets of her coat. "You shouldn't be down here alone," she said. "Why?" "Because if the files start matching you, it helps to have a witness." I almost laughed. "A witness to what?" "Paperwork?" "To the direction it moves." I held up the unsigned rules. "Why didn't you tell me about these before?" "I did," she said. "You're not with the page. With enough." "No. You managed me. There's a difference." That hit somewhere, but not enough to crack her composure. "If I'd told you everything the first day, you would have done exactly what you're thinking about now." I knew she was right, which made me angrier. "I'm not staying here while it rewrites me." She took a breath. The basement light flattened her face, made her look older and more tired than she usually did. "It's already doing that. The question is whether you let it keep other people out of the line of fire." I didn't understand what she meant then. I understood later when I saw what happened to the names nearest a damaged record. By that night, I had stopped trusting my own recollection enough to know whether I'd gone home the evening before. My truck was in the lot. My coat was on the chair. There was a toothbrush in my office drawer I didn't remember bringing in. Every surface seemed to carry a film of paper dust now, even the stainless steel counters, even the sink taps. When I rubbed my fingers together, I could feel grit. The moral shape of the thing finally showed itself just before midnight. I had locked myself in the records room with the original ranch file, the corrected version, and every duplicate I could find. If the system wanted consistency, I thought, then I would remove the contradiction at the source. Burn it, shred it, dissolve it. If there was no original false report left to reconcile, maybe the pressure would collapse. That was desperation pretending to be reason. The shredder sat under the side counter. Old industrial model, loud enough to wake the dead if you believed in that sort of phrase. I fed in one duplicate of the falsified report, just the first page with my altered conclusion. The machine bit, chewed, and then every printer in the office started at once, not one or two, all of them. The sound was unbearable in the closed room, a chorus of dry, mechanical breath. Pages spilled into trays down the hall. I could hear them hitting tiles, sliding off desks, cascading in the clerk's office, intake, prep, all of it. The fluorescent lights flickered so hard the room strobed. Then the network terminal refreshed. New case files populated across the screen in rapid sequence. Names I recognized from active county employees: custodian, transport driver, records temp. Then family members from recent death certificates. Then people from unrelated pending cases who had nothing to do with my report except proximity in the filing chain. Each new entry bore the same notation: reassigned pending discrepancy correction. I stopped the shredder so fast the paper tore in my hand. On the monitor, one file opened on its own. A woman who had died of natural causes 2 weeks earlier. Her certified manner changed mid-line. Her son's name appeared in the subject field. Then his birth date, then an employee code from county maintenance. The office was pushing the contradiction outward. Not randomly, logically. If it couldn't make the false report true through me, it would adjust the surrounding records until the books balanced some other way. That was the choice. Not abstract, not philosophical, material and immediate. Accept the correction and let the system close around me. Or destroy the records and watch it start assigning the cost to other people. I remember standing there with the torn page in one hand, and a hot chemical smell rising from the overworked shredder motor, listening to papers spit into rooms I couldn't see. The lights hummed. My heart pounded too high in my throat. Somewhere down the hall, a drawer seal released with a wet rubber exhale. I could still resist. I could dump solvent into the cabinets, flood the archive sprinklers, drag boxes outside and burn them in the lot before dawn. I knew where the backups were stored. I knew what to cut, what to smash, how long it would take, and I knew exactly what I'd be doing if I did. The same thing I had done 3 years earlier. Taking a truth that threatened me and pushing the cost of it onto people with less power to refuse. That recognition sickened me more than the office ever had. I opened the records room door. Papers lay across the hall like drifts after a hard wind. Fresh print still curled in the trays. Some pages had my signature, some had none. I stepped over a stack and saw one file on the floor listing me as deceased, intake pending, cause of death clerical discrepancy. Another page beneath it reassigned a dormant archive case to the name of the transport driver who had brought in my double. I heard a metal drawer slide open in cold storage, then another. I followed the sound. The prep room lights were brighter than the hall, reflecting off the stainless steel hard enough to hurt. My own face flashed at me in every cabinet door and instrument tray, but in each reflection there was a white intake tag hanging at my throat, swaying slightly when I moved. When I touched my neck, there was nothing there. In the steel, the tag remained. Elila was in the room. She stood at the main table with a body bag unzipped and paperwork aligned in perfect order beside her. Her motions were small and exact. Glove snap, pen uncapped, wrist angled. I knew that rhythm. It was the rhythm of surrender disguised as professionalism. The tag on the bag bore her name, Lila Granger. She saw me in the reflection before she turned around. "I hoped you'd stop with the duplicate," she said. My voice felt rough. "That's you?" "Yes. You're processing your own body." She glanced down at the form. "I'm processing a match." The body on the table looked enough like her to trigger that same sick bodily recognition I'd felt in intake. Hair pinned back, similar build, one side of the face hidden by shadow and refrigeration bloom. Not identical, close enough for the office. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Because I learned the expensive way what happens when you don't." There was no fear in her voice now. Not because she lacked it, because it had already been spent. She signed one line, then another. "I used to think if I stayed skeptical it would leave me outside it," she said. "That's the part you still don't understand. Skepticism is only useful if the thing needs your belief. This doesn't." I looked at the bag, looked at her name on the paperwork, looked at the reflections all around us with their silent, swinging tags. "You said practical," I whispered. "It is practical." "That's not living." "No," she said, "it's preventing spread." There was the ambiguity of her that never left me. I still don't know if she was saving others, saving herself, or simply too changed by then to separate the two. She slid a form toward me across the steel. My intake documentation, already printed, already signed by me on 3 lines. Only the processing acknowledgement remained blank. "If you sign," she said, "it localizes. And if I don't..." Her eyes flicked toward the hall where the printers still ran in ragged bursts. "You've seen." I had. That should make the choice sound simple in retrospect. It wasn't. It sat there between us with equal weight on both sides. Sign and let the office file me as dead, erase my standing, maybe my name, maybe more than that. Refuse and keep fighting, knowing the fight itself would redistribute the correction through innocent cases until somebody else matched well enough to take the load. I thought about the worker behind the calving shed, and about how easy it had been to tell myself one dead man with no local leverage was a manageable moral cost, about how administrative harm always arrives dressed as triage. The building hummed around us, paper scratched in the distance, cold breathed out of open drawers. I took the form. My hand trembled once, then steadied. Years of training did what panic couldn't stop. I reviewed the fields automatically. Name, height, identifying scar, date of death, cause, clerical discrepancy. I nearly contradicted it out loud. Rule 5 flashed through my head, too late to matter. Instead, I set the pen down and said, "If I do this, what gets restored?" Lila answered with brutal honesty. "I don't know." That was the worst part. Not evil, not certainty, procedure without moral transparency. I signed the final line. The printer stopped, not gradually, either at once, every scratch cut off mid-feed. The sudden silence pressed on my ears. From cold storage, drawer seals engaged one by one with dull rubber thuds. The overhead buzzing settled into its ordinary uneven whir. Somewhere a faucet dripped, normal building sounds, or normal enough to pass. Lila took the form and clipped it to the packet without looking at me. "Go," she said. "Where?" "Anywhere the county can't ask you for identification." I almost asked if that meant I was still alive. The fact that I didn't tells you more about my state of mind than any dramatic line could. I left through the rear exit before dawn, snow smell in the air, though none had fallen yet. My truck keys worked. My house key worked. My body kept going, which was answer enough for practical purposes. By noon, according to every official record in Stillwater County, Warren Kessler was deceased. That was the clean closure of the main action. Everything after has been residue. My bank flagged me. My license invalidated. Payroll ceased. The county sent a condolence form letter to my address addressed to next of kin. There was no next of kin listed because I'd outlived the people who would have filled that line. I existed physically and nowhere else. For a while, I thought that meant the office had restored truth at last. My false report exposed, my authority removed, fair exchange. Then weeks later, I went back after dark. I shouldn't have, but once you've spent your life believing records define the edges of reality, you can't survive being excluded from them without wanting to see the mechanism again. The building looked the same from the lot. The same sodium light at the rear door. Same insulated hall to the clerk annex. Same hum through the walls if you stood close enough. I watched through the narrow window in the office door while a new coroner sat at my old desk, shoulders slightly hunched, learning where the drawers stuck and which overhead light buzzed sharpest. He opened a case file. I knew it before I saw the header. Ranch west of town. First hard freeze. Migrant worker found behind calving shed. He read for a long time. Then he turned the page, picked up his pen, and made a note in the margin. I couldn't read his handwriting through the glass. I didn't need to. When he leaned back, the cause of death line was visible in the desk lamp light. Accidental exposure. So that's the part I still can't tell you. Whether the system corrected the lie and then corrected me for making it, or whether it corrected me so the lie could live on without contradiction. Both explanations fit what happened. Both require the same terrible premise, that once a county writes something down cleanly enough, the world starts editing itself to match. I know only 3 things for certain. The office is still operating. Warren Kessler is still dead on paper. And every time I catch my reflection in a dark window, I look at my throat before I look at my face,